On July 24, 1948, a woman died in her mansion at 15 DuPont Circle. In Washington, D.C., the house contained 60 rooms. She owned it outright. She also owned a country estate in Maryland with hundreds of acres, another property in Wyoming, and a newspaper that had shaped political conversation for decades. Her name was Eleanor Medill Patterson, Cissy to those who knew her, and she died alone in her bedroom on a summer morning, found by a servant who had knocked repeatedly before entering. The funeral was attended by politicians, journalists, and society figures who had once competed for her attention. They filled the pews. They spoke carefully, but the crowd felt thin in a way that had nothing to do with numbers. Her daughter did not cry. Her brother had been dead for years. The estates she left behind would become problems for executors to solve, beautiful properties no one particularly wanted. Cissy Patterson had spent her life inside rooms that most people would never enter. She had married a count, edited a major newspaper, hosted presidents, and lived according to rules written by wealth itself. She was born into one of America's most powerful families and remained powerful until the day she stopped breathing. But power, it turned out, was not the same as shelter. Wealth was not the same as safety. And control over a newspaper did not mean control over what mattered. This is not a story about success. It is a story about what happens when every advantage is given, and still, something crucial is missing from the beginning. Eleanor Medill Patterson was born on November 7, 1881 in Chicago, into a family that did not need to explain itself. Her grandfather, Joseph Medill, owned the Chicago Tribune. Her father, Robert Wilson Patterson, would eventually run it. Her mother, Eleanor Medill Patterson, came from the same newspaper dynasty, a marriage that consolidated power rather than created it. The house they lived in was large. The staff was always present. The money was simply there, like air. But affection was not. Cissy's mother was cold in a way that felt deliberate. Eleanor Medill Patterson did not embrace her daughter often. She corrected her constantly. There were standards to uphold: posture, diction, comportment, the way one entered a room. Cissy learned early that approval was conditional and always slightly out of reach. Her mother's attention came in the form of critiques, adjustments, reminders that she was not yet acceptable, but might become so if she worked harder at being someone else. Her father was distant in a different way. Robert Patterson existed behind the newspaper, behind closed doors, behind conversations Cissy was not invited to join. He was busy. He was important. He had work that mattered more than whatever a small daughter might need. When he looked at her, it was with the mild interest one might show a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. Her brother, Joseph Medill Patterson, was older. He had the name that mattered. He would inherit the weight of the family's expectations in a way Cissy never would, not because she was less capable, but because she was female, and the rules were simple about that. Joe was serious, ambitious, already absorbing the language of power. Cissy orbited him. She wanted his attention. She rarely got it. The household ran on schedules, meals happened at specific times, governesses arrived and departed, tutors came to teach languages, history, penmanship. Cissy learned French. She learned how to sit still for hours. She learned that her thoughts were less interesting than her appearance, and that both were constantly being evaluated by people who did not explain the criteria. There were parties, but they were not for her. She would see her mother dressed in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, leaving for events where decisions were made and alliances were formed. Cissy stayed behind. She watched from the stairs. She understood without being told that her value would eventually be determined by marriage, and that everything she was being taught was preparation for that transaction. She was not unhappy in the way that produced obvious rebellion. She was unhappy in the quieter way of a child who learns that love is something you earn by being perfect, and that perfection is not actually possible. She became watchful. She studied the adults around her, trying to decode the rules. She learned to smile when expected. She learned to be silent when necessary. She learned that people with money did not talk about money, but that every interaction was shaped by it nonetheless. In 1893, when Cissy was 12, her grandfather Joseph Medill died. The family gathered. There was mourning, but it was formal, structured, as though grief itself needed to follow a protocol. The funeral was large, Important men attended. The Tribune published long tributes, and then the estate was divided, the power redistributed, the machine of the family continuing without pause. Cissy noticed something during those weeks. No one seemed to miss her grandfather as a person. They missed his authority. They missed his position. They spoke about what he had built, not who he had been. It was her first clear lesson that even within a family, even with all the wealth and all the proximity, a person could be valued for their function and forgotten as soon as the function ended. Her mother's coldness deepened after the death. Or perhaps it had always been this deep, and Cissy was simply old enough now to name it. Eleanor became more rigid about social expectations. There were more lessons, more corrections, more reminders that Cissy needed to prepare herself for society. She was approaching the age where she would be introduced, evaluated, and, if she performed correctly, selected by a man whose family deemed the Pattersons acceptable. Cissy's education was comprehensive in some ways and entirely absent in others. She learned to speak multiple languages, but not to ask difficult questions. She learned European history, but not how to think independently about it. She learned etiquette, but not how to recognize when etiquette was a trap. Everything she was taught reinforced a single idea. A woman's life was something that happened to her, not something she built. She read books when she could, novels mostly. She liked stories where women had choices, where they ran away or defied expectations, or did something other than wait to be chosen. But those were stories. In her actual life, there was a script, and deviating from it was not presented as an option. By the time she turned 14, Cissy had already absorbed the fundamental loneliness of her position. She lived in a house full of people and felt entirely alone. She had a family that controlled a major newspaper, that moved through the highest levels of society, that could make or destroy reputations with a single editorial decision. And none of that power extended to her in any meaningful way. It belonged to the men. She would be transferred eventually to another man, in another house, where the loneliness would likely continue under a different name. There were moments when she tested the boundaries, small rebellions, a sharp comment at dinner, a refusal to wear a particular dress. Her mother's response was always swift and cold. Cissy learned that resistance produced isolation, and isolation was unbearable, so she stopped resisting in visible ways. The anger went inward instead. She was pretty. People told her so. It was meant as a compliment, but it felt like an appraisal. Her looks were an asset, something to be managed and deployed. She began to understand that beauty, in her world, was another form of currency. And like all currency in her family, it would eventually be spent on a transaction she had not chosen. At 15, Cissy Patterson stood at the edge of her debut into society. She had been trained. She had been prepared. She looked the part. But underneath the silk and the lessons and the carefully maintained smile, there was already something broken. Something that no amount of wealth or status had managed to fix. She did not know it yet, but the breaking had only just begun. Cissy's debut into society happened in 1901, when she was 19. She had been groomed for this moment her entire life, and yet, when it arrived, it felt less like an arrival and more like being placed on a stage where everyone already knew the script except her. The debutante season in Washington and New York was not a celebration. It was an audition. Young women were presented, evaluated, and sorted according to criteria no one stated explicitly, but everyone understood perfectly. She wore white. All the debutantes wore white. The gowns cost hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands, constructed by dressmakers who specialized in making young women look like expensive objects. Cissy's gown fit perfectly. Her hair was arranged by a woman whose only job was arranging hair. She looked, by all measures, like exactly what she was supposed to be, a beautiful girl from a powerful family, available for the right kind of marriage. The parties were exhausting. There were dinners that lasted 4 hours with 7 courses and strict rules about which fork to use and when to speak and how much wine was appropriate for a young woman, which was very little. There were balls where Cissy danced with men she had just met, making pleasant conversation, while they assessed her the way one might assess a horse before purchase. Good bloodlines, decent temperament, acceptable appearance. Her mother watched from the edges of these events, monitoring Cissy's performance with the intensity of someone whose own reputation depended on the outcome. After each party, there were debriefings. Eleanor would point out the mistakes. Cissy had laughed too loudly at one point, or had failed to engage sufficiently with a particular young man whose family owned railroads, or had looked bored during a conversation about yachting. The corrections were delivered in the carriage ride home, in the hallway outside Cissy's bedroom, in every private moment when her mother could make clear that nothing Cissy had done was quite good enough. The men who courted her were predictable. They were from families like hers, old money or new money that had aged into respectability. They were educated at the right schools. They spoke about business and politics with the casual authority of people who had never been told they were wrong. They were interested in Cissy the way they might be interested in acquiring property in a desirable neighborhood. She was pretty, connected, and came with access to one of the most powerful newspapers in the country. That mattered more than anything she might actually think or feel. There was one man, briefly, who seemed different. His name was Frederick McLaughlin, and he was charming in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He asked Cissy questions about herself, not just polite questions, but actual questions, as though her answers might matter. They talked at a dinner in New York. He was funny. He listened. For a moment, Cissy allowed herself to imagine that marriage might be something other than a prison with better furniture. But Frederick's family did not have enough money. Or rather, they had money, but not the right kind, not the kind that made them suitable for a Patterson. Eleanor made this clear in a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. Frederick was not an option. Cissy did not argue. She had learned by now that arguing changed nothing. Frederick disappeared from her life as quickly as he had entered it, and Cissy returned to the rotation of acceptable suitors who bored her. The pressure intensified as months passed without an engagement. Other girls from her debut season were getting married. Announcements appeared in the society pages. Eleanor showed these announcements to Cissy, not saying anything directly, but making the implication clear. Time was passing, Cissy was not getting younger, and failure to secure a marriage would reflect poorly on everyone. Cissy began to feel the weight of being looked at. Everywhere she went, people were assessing her. At parties, in receiving lines, during afternoon teas where women gathered to discuss nothing of consequence, while their husbands made actual decisions elsewhere. She was always performing, always being evaluated, and the evaluation was never about who she was, only about whether she would be acceptable to a man whose acceptance would determine the rest of her life. In 1902, she met Count Joseph Gizicki at a party in Washington. He was Polish, titled older than her by 15 years. He had an estate in Europe. He spoke several languages. He paid attention to Cissy in a way that felt overwhelming after months of tepid interest from American suitors. He was intense. He sent flowers. He wrote letters. He made her feel like she was the only woman in the room, which was intoxicating to someone who had spent years feeling like an item on a shelf waiting to be selected. Her mother approved. A count was better than a businessman. European nobility carried a certain cachet that American wealth could not quite replicate. The Patterson family had money, but Joseph had a title, and the combination felt like an elevation. Eleanor began planning before Cissy had fully decided, already discussing wedding dates and guest lists, and which relatives would need to be invited even though they were tiresome. Joseph was attentive during the courtship. He took Cissy to the opera. He told her about his estate in Poland, describing a life that sounded romantic and far away from the suffocating social structure of Washington. He made promises about how different things would be in Europe, how much freedom she would have, how she would finally be away from her mother's constant surveillance. And Cissy wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that marriage could be an escape rather than a transfer from one form of confinement to another. She was 22. She was tired of being evaluated and found lacking. She was tired of her mother's criticism and her father's indifference and the exhausting performance of being a debutante who had not yet secured her future. Joseph offered something that looked like a way out. In January 1904, Cissy accepted his proposal. The engagement was announced in all the major newspapers. The wedding was scheduled for April. Eleanor was satisfied. Robert Patterson was satisfied. The family had successfully completed the transaction. Cissy was to become a countess. which sounded impressive in the society pages and made the Patterson name seem even more significant than it already was. But Cissy, standing in her bedroom the night after the engagement was announced, surrounded by congratulations she did not quite feel, noticed something she had been too distracted to notice during the courtship. Joseph's attentiveness had an edge to it. His intensity was not just romantic, it was controlling. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He made decisions for her without asking. He spoke about their future in a way that left no room for her input. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself all men were like this. She told herself that marriage was marriage, and she had agreed to it, and it was too late to reconsider. The wedding invitations had already been printed. The wedding took place on April 14, 1904, at St. Paul's Church in Washington. Cissy wore a gown that cost more than most families earned in a decade. The church was filled with flowers. The guest list included senators, judges, newspaper magnates, and representatives from European aristocracy who had traveled across the Atlantic to witness the union of American money and Polish nobility. The ceremony was reported in detail by every major newspaper, including the Chicago Tribune, which described Cissy as radiant and Joseph as distinguished. She was not radiant, she was terrified, but terror, in her world, was something you covered with a smile. The honeymoon began in Europe. Joseph took her to Paris first, where they stayed in a hotel that catered to people who did not need to ask about prices. He bought her jewelry. He took her to restaurants where the menus were in French, and the waiters treated them with the deference reserved for titled guests. It should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like a preview of something Cissy could not yet name. Joseph's attention, which had seemed flattering during the courtship, became suffocating the moment they were alone. He wanted to know where she was every minute. He chose her clothes. He decided which social events they would attend. He made plans without consulting her and became angry when she expressed preferences that differed from his. The anger was quiet at first, a coldness, a withdrawal of affection, a way of speaking to her that made it clear she had disappointed him. By the time they arrived at his estate in Poland, Cissy understood that she had made a mistake. The estate was called Nowosielica. It was remote, surrounded by fields and forests, far from any city. The house was large but decaying. The servants spoke Polish and Russian, languages Cissy did not know. Joseph spoke to them in tones she recognized, even without translation, the voice of someone who believed certain people existed to serve and others existed to be served. The isolation was immediate. There were no neighbors she could visit, no social calendar to fill the days, no escape into the kind of shallow but distracting activities that had structured her life in Washington. There was only the estate, the servants, and Joseph, whose moods determined whether each day would be tolerable or unbearable. He began hitting her within the first year. Not frequently enough to feel constant, but often enough that she lived in anticipation of it. The violence was unpredictable. Sometimes it came after arguments. Sometimes it came after nothing at all. Just Joseph's generalized displeasure with something Cissy had said or failed to say or done or failed to do. He never apologized. He never acknowledged it the next day. The bruises faded and life continued, and Cissy learned to move carefully through the house, trying to avoid whatever might trigger his anger. She wrote letters to her family. She tried to explain what was happening, but the words felt impossible. How did you tell your mother, who had orchestrated this marriage, that the Count was not what he had seemed? How did you admit that the escape you had chosen was worse than what you had escaped from? Her letters became vague, full of polite descriptions of the estate and the weather and nothing of substance. Her mother wrote back with news from Washington and complaints about minor social inconveniences, as though Cissy's life in Poland was simply an extended vacation. In 1905, Cissy became pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. She was sick constantly. There was no doctor nearby, only a local midwife who spoke no English. Joseph was not interested in her discomfort. He expected her to manage the household, to appear at meals, to fulfill her obligations as his wife regardless of how she felt. The servants watched her with expressions she could not read. Pity, perhaps, or recognition that this was simply how things worked in marriages like hers. The baby was born in January 1906, a daughter. Cissy named her Felicia. The birth was long and painful, and afterward Cissy felt something inside her shift that had nothing to do with physical recovery. She looked at the baby and understood that this child was now trapped in the same situation, Cissy had walked into voluntarily. Felicia would grow up in this house with this father, learning that violence was normal and love was conditional. Joseph was disappointed the baby was not a son. He said so directly. He spent less time at the estate after Felicia's birth, traveling to Vienna and St. Petersburg and other cities, where he had business or friends or women, Cissy suspected but could not prove. When he was gone, the house felt safer. Cissy could breathe. She could hold her daughter without worrying that Joseph would criticize how she was doing it. But he always came back. In 1907, Cissy's mother visited Poland. Eleanor arrived with trunks full of American luxuries and complaints about the journey. She stayed for 2 weeks. Cissy tried to tell her what was happening. She showed her mother the library where Joseph had locked her once during an argument. She described his rages. She asked, as directly as she could manage, for help. Eleanor listened with the expression of someone hearing about a minor inconvenience. She told Cissy that all marriages required adjustment. She said that Joseph was under pressure managing his estate and his title. She suggested that Cissy was perhaps too sensitive, too American, not understanding the different expectations of European aristocracy. She said that divorce was not an option. It would be a scandal, and the Patterson family did not produce scandals. When Eleanor left, Cissy knew she was alone in a way that went beyond geography. By 1908, Cissy had stopped pretending the marriage could be fixed. She had also stopped believing her family would help her. But she had a daughter now, and that changed the calculation. She could endure Joseph for herself, but watching him dismiss and belittle Felicia, watching the child learn to flinch at her father's voice, made endurance feel like complicity. She began planning her escape. She saved money from the household accounts. She wrote to her brother Joe, explaining the situation more directly than she had dared before. She contacted a lawyer in Vienna. She started gathering documents, marriage certificates, financial records, anything that might be useful later. Joseph noticed. He always noticed. In March 1908, he confronted her in the library. He had found some of the letters. He knew she was planning to leave. The argument that followed was the worst yet. He told her she would never see Felicia again if she tried to go. He told her that no court would side with an American woman against a Polish count. He told her she had no power, no options, and no way out. He was wrong about the last part. Cissy had money her family had given her, money Joseph did not control. In April 1908, while Joseph was traveling, she packed what she could carry, took Felicia, and left Novoselica. She made it to Vienna. She bought tickets for a ship back to America. She believed for a brief moment that the worst was over. Cissy arrived in New York in May 1908 with her daughter and almost nothing else. The crossing had been tense. She had spent the entire voyage waiting for someone to stop her, to tell her that Joseph had sent word that she needed to turn back. But no one stopped her. She reached American soil believing she had succeeded. Her family met her in Washington. Her mother's reception was not warm. Eleanor looked at Cissy with the expression of someone who had predicted this failure and was not pleased to be proven correct. Robert Patterson was even less sympathetic. He spoke to Cissy in his study the day after she arrived, explaining that her situation was embarrassing for the family, that leaving a titled husband reflected poorly on everyone, that she needed to consider the implications for the Tribune's social standing. Cissy tried to explain the violence. Her father listened without expression. When she finished, he told her that marriage was difficult for everyone and that she had made a commitment she was now abandoning. He did not ask to see bruises. He did not suggest that Joseph's behavior was unacceptable. He simply made clear that Cissy's decision to leave had created a problem, and the problem was hers to manage. She moved into her family's home in Washington with Felicia. The house that had felt suffocating during her childhood now felt like the only safe place available. She avoided social events. The gossip had already started. Stories about the countess who had fled her marriage, rumors about what she had done or failed to do to cause the collapse. The same women who had attended her wedding now discussed her failure in drawing rooms across the city. Cissy filed for divorce in August 1908. The legal process was complicated by the fact that she had married a foreign national on foreign soil. Joseph contested everything. He sent lawyers. He sent letters accusing Cissy of abandoning her duties, of being mentally unstable, of being an unfit mother. He demanded that Felicia be returned to Poland. The case dragged on for months. Cissy's lawyers argued that Joseph had been violent and that Felicia was safer in America. Joseph's lawyers argued that Cissy had kidnapped the child, and that Polish law gave him full custody. The courts were not particularly sympathetic to either position. Divorce cases involving international marriages and contested custody were rare enough that there was no clear precedent, and judges moved slowly through the arguments while Cissy waited in Washington, trying to build some kind of life with her daughter. Felicia was 3 years old. She asked about her father sometimes. Cissy did not know how to answer. How did you explain to a child that her father was dangerous? How did you describe violence to someone too young to understand it? Cissy deflected, changed the subject, tried to make their days in Washington feel stable, even though nothing felt stable. In 1909, the divorce was granted. Cissy felt a brief surge of relief. The marriage was over. She had legal documentation proving it. She believed that meant she was free. She was wrong. Joseph did not accept the divorce. In Poland, he challenged its legitimacy. He argued that the American court had no jurisdiction over a marriage conducted in Europe between a Polish citizen and an American woman who had become a Polish countess through that marriage. The Polish court sided with him. They ruled that the marriage was still valid under Polish law and that Felicia was legally required to return to her father. Cissy ignored the ruling. She was in America. Joseph was in Poland. She assumed geography would protect her. In March 1910, Joseph arrived in Washington. Cissy did not know he was in the country until he appeared at her family's home with a lawyer and a court order from Poland demanding that Felicia be turned over to his custody. The American authorities were uncertain how to proceed. The Polish order was not enforceable in the United States, but Joseph had money and connections, and he was making the situation as public and as complicated as possible. Cissy hired more lawyers. The case went back to court. This time, the arguments were even more tangled. Questions about international custody law, about which countries' courts had precedents, about whether Joseph's violence in Poland was relevant to custody decisions in America. The lawyers filed motions. The judges requested more documentation. Weeks turned into months. And then, in August 1910, Felicia disappeared. Cissy had taken her daughter to spend a few days at a resort in the Berkshires, trying to give the girl something resembling a normal childhood. She left Felicia with a governess one afternoon while she attended to some correspondence. When she returned, the governess was frantic. Felicia was gone. There had been a man, the governess said, someone who claimed to have permission to take the child for a walk. Joseph had taken her. He had planned it carefully, waiting until Cissy let her guard down. By the time Cissy understood what had happened, Joseph and Felicia were already on a ship back to Europe. The panic was immediate and total. Cissy contacted the police. She contacted the State Department. She contacted every lawyer who would take her calls. But there was nothing anyone could do. Joseph was a Polish count traveling with his daughter to his own country. No one was going to stop him. No one was going to force him to return the child. Cissy tried to follow. She booked passage on the next available ship. But by the time she reached Europe, Joseph had taken Felicia to Russia, far from any jurisdiction where American pressure might have influence. He moved constantly, staying in different cities, making sure Cissy could not locate them. When she finally tracked them to St. Petersburg months later, Joseph had already left for another city. The pursuit continued for over a year. Cissy traveled across Europe, following tips and rumors, arriving in cities days or weeks after Joseph had departed. She hired private investigators. She bribed officials. She used every connection her family had, every favor the Tribune's influence could generate. None of it worked. Joseph was always one step ahead, and he had the advantage of operating in countries where his title carried weight and Cissy's American money meant less. In 1911, exhausted and desperate, Cissy made a deal. Joseph's lawyers contacted her with an offer. She could see Felicia if she agreed to stop pursuing full custody. The terms were humiliating. She would be allowed supervised visits no more than a few weeks per year, always at locations Joseph chose. She would have no legal rights to her daughter. She would acknowledge that Joseph was the primary parent and that Felicia's home was with him in Europe. Cissy signed the agreement. She had no choice. The alternative was never seeing Felicia again. The visits were brief and painful. Felicia, now 6, barely remembered her mother. She spoke Polish more fluently than English. She had been told things about Cissy, lies probably, or distortions, that made her wary and distant. The child who had once clung to Cissy was now a stranger who tolerated her presence, but showed no affection. Cissy returned to Washington in 1912. The divorce was finalized under terms that gave Joseph everything. She had lost her daughter. She had spent years fighting and achieved nothing, and everyone in Washington knew it. The women who had gossiped about her leaving the marriage now gossiped about her failure to keep her child. The story became another piece of social currency, another scandal discussed over tea. Her family did not comfort her. They had spent considerable money on lawyers and gained nothing but embarrassment. Eleanor made it clear that Cissy had brought this on herself by marrying Joseph in the first place, by leaving him impulsively, by handling the situation poorly. Robert Patterson stopped discussing it entirely, as though Felicia had simply ceased to exist. Cissy moved into an apartment alone. She was 31 years old. She had been married and divorced. She had lost custody of her only child. And all the money, all the connections, all the power of the Patterson name had not been enough to protect her from a single, determined man who understood that certain kinds of violence were perfectly legal. After losing Felicia, Cissy spent 2 years barely functioning. She lived in her apartment in Washington, declined most social invitations, and drank more than she should have. The women who had once competed for her company now avoided her. Divorce was one thing. Many marriages failed quietly and were dissolved with appropriate discretion. But losing custody of a child suggested something worse, some fundamental inadequacy that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. Her mother told her she needed to move forward. Eleanor said this in the same tone she might use to discuss rearranging furniture. The past was the past. Cissy was still young enough to marry again, assuming she could repair her reputation and find someone willing to overlook the scandal. Staying alone, staying bitter, would only make things worse. Cissy met Elmer Schlesinger in 1914. He was a lawyer, wealthy in his own right, from a prominent family. He was steady where Joseph had been volatile. He was American, practical, uninterested in drama. He listened when Cissy talked about Felicia, and he did not judge her for the failure of her first marriage. He seemed, in every measurable way, like the opposite of the Count. They married in 1925, after years of courtship that felt more like negotiation than romance. Cissy was 43. Elmer was practical about what he wanted. A wife who understood his world, who could host dinners and manage households, and provide the kind of social stability his career required. He did not promise passion. He promised partnership, which sounded reasonable to someone who had learned that passion usually meant pain. The marriage was functional. They lived well. Elmer had houses in Washington and New York. They traveled occasionally, though never to Europe. Cissy refused to go anywhere near Poland or Russia or any place that might remind her of Joseph. They hosted dinners for Elmer's colleagues and clients. Cissy performed the role of wife competently, making conversation, ensuring the staff prepared meals correctly, wearing appropriate clothes. But there was no warmth. Elmer was kind in the abstract way of someone who believed in treating people decently, but did not particularly need emotional connection. He worked long hours. He came home tired. He was polite to Cissy and mostly disinterested in her internal life. They shared a house, but not much else. The distance between them became more obvious as years passed. They slept in separate bedrooms, which was common enough in their social class, but still felt like an acknowledgement of something missing. They rarely touched. Their conversations stayed on safe topics: household matters, social obligations, news from the Tribune. Cissy found herself performing intimacy the same way she performed everything else, going through the motions, because that was what was expected. She still thought about Felicia constantly. The supervised visits continued, though they were infrequent and increasingly strained. Felicia was growing up in Europe, shaped by Joseph's bitterness and Cissy's absence. By the time Felicia was a teenager, the visits felt like meetings between strangers who shared a biological connection, but nothing else. Cissy tried to bridge the gap, bringing gifts, asking questions, trying to show interest in her daughter's life. Felicia was polite, but cold. Mirroring the distance Joseph had taught her was appropriate. Elmer did not understand why Cissy dwelled on it. He told her more than once that she needed to accept the situation and move on. He said it was unhealthy to fixate on something she could not change. He suggested that perhaps it was better for everyone if Felicia grew up with her father, since clearly the child was settled there and disrupting that would only cause more problems. Cissy stopped talking to him about it. The loneliness of the second marriage was different from the loneliness of the first. Joseph had been violent and controlling, but at least the conflict had been visible. With Elmer, there was no conflict because there was no real engagement. He was not cruel. He was simply absent in every way that mattered. They existed in parallel, sharing space, but not lives. Cissy began spending more time with her brother Joe. He had taken over much of the Tribune's operations and had strong opinions about journalism and politics. They argued frequently. Joe was more liberal than Cissy, more willing to challenge their family's traditional positions. But the arguments felt alive in a way that nothing in Cissy's marriage did. Joe paid attention to what she thought. He disagreed with her, but respected that she had thoughts worth disagreeing with. In 1920, Cissy's mother died. Eleanor Patterson had been ill for several months, and her death was not unexpected, but it still hit Cissy harder than she anticipated. Her mother had been cold, critical, impossible to please. She had orchestrated Cissy's disastrous first marriage and offered no real support during the custody battle. She had made Cissy feel inadequate for her entire life, and yet her death felt like losing the only person who had paid consistent attention, even if that attention had been primarily negative. Cissy stood at the funeral and realized she was crying, not because she would miss her mother, but because she had spent 40 years waiting for her mother's approval and would now never receive it. The inheritance was substantial. Eleanor left money and property divided between Cissy and Joe. Cissy suddenly had resources that were entirely her own, not tied to Elmer or her father or any man. The money did not make her happy, but it made her less dependent, which felt like a kind of freedom. She began to chafe more obviously against the constraints of her marriage. Elmer wanted her to attend certain events, to maintain certain appearances, to behave in ways that supported his career. Cissy complied less reliably. She started declining invitations she found boring. She spent money on things Elmer considered frivolous. She drank at parties in ways that made him uncomfortable, not because she was causing scenes, but because she was enjoying herself without regard for what people might think. They argued about it, though Elmer's version of arguing was delivering calm, reasonable lectures about appropriate behavior. He told her she was embarrassing herself. He suggested she was going through some kind of crisis. He implied that her inability to move past her first marriage was affecting her judgment. Cissy listened and did not change. By 1925, the marriage existed only on paper. They lived in the same house but led separate lives. Elmer had his work. Cissy had her inheritance and her brother and a growing restlessness that money and respectability had not managed to contain. They did not discuss divorce. It would have been yet another scandal, and Elmer had no interest in scandal. But they stopped pretending the marriage was anything more than a convenient arrangement. Cissy was in her mid-40s. She had married twice. Both marriages had been failures in different ways. She had lost her daughter and gained nothing worth having in return. She had wealth, social position, all the external markers of success. And she was profoundly, irreversibly alone. In 1925, William Randolph Hearst offered Cissy Patterson the editorship of the Washington Herald. The offer came through her brother Joe, who had maintained connections with Hearst through the newspaper business. Hearst owned the Herald but needed someone to run it, someone with the right social connections and the willingness to make the paper profitable in a city dominated by political coverage. Cissy was not the obvious choice. She had no journalism experience. She had never worked in any formal sense. She was a socialite who had spent most of her adult life managing households and attending parties and failing at marriage. But Hearst saw something useful. She knew everyone in Washington. She understood how power moved through the city, and she was willing to take risks that more cautious editors would avoid. She accepted. Not because she had a passion for journalism, but because she needed something to do with the rage that had been building for 20 years. The newspaper gave her a weapon. Her first day at the Herald offices was awkward. The staff had expected a figurehead, a society woman who would host parties and let the real journalists run the operation. Instead, Cissy showed up every morning. She read every section. She questioned decisions. She learned how the business worked, circulation numbers, advertising rates, distribution networks, the mechanics of putting out a daily paper. The male journalists resented her. They made this clear in small ways, talking over her in meetings, failing to include her in discussions, treating her suggestions as amusing rather than serious. Cissy noticed. She did not complain. She simply started firing people. The first editor she dismissed had ignored a story she wanted on the front page. He had explained, with condescension barely concealed, that she did not understand how newspapers worked. She let him finish his explanation. Then she told him to clear his desk. The second firing happened a week later for similar reasons. By the end of her first month, the staff understood that she was not interested in being liked. The Herald, under Cissy's control, became sharper and more personal. She ran stories about Washington society that revealed affairs, financial problems, and scandals the other papers avoided. She understood that people in power were most vulnerable when their private lives became public, and she had no hesitation about exposing them. Some of the coverage was justified. She ran investigations into corruption, into politicians using their positions for personal gain, into the ways money moved through Washington without accountability. But some of it was revenge. She used the paper to settle scores with people who had snubbed her, who had gossiped about her divorces, who had made her feel small during the years when she had no power of her own. There was a senator who had made a joke about Cissy at a dinner party in 1912, something about unstable women who could not keep husbands or children. Cissy had heard about it secondhand and never forgotten. In 1926, the Herald ran a series of articles about the senator's financial dealings, connections to a construction company that had received favorable contracts, money that had moved in directions it should not have moved. The senator lost his re-election bid. Cissy never acknowledged that the coverage had been personal, but everyone who knew her understood. She attended editorial meetings every morning, making decisions about what ran on the front page, which stories got follow-up coverage, how aggressively reporters should pursue particular leads. She was not interested in objectivity. She wanted the paper to have a voice, her voice, and that voice was often angry. The circulation numbers improved. People bought the Herald because it was unpredictable, because Cissy was willing to print things other editors considered too inflammatory or too personal. The advertisers followed the circulation. By 1927, the paper was profitable, and Hearst was pleased, but Cissy's social life deteriorated. The same people she had once hosted at dinners stopped accepting her invitations. They knew the Herald was watching them, that any misstep could become a headline. Former friends became sources or targets. The line between the two was often unclear. Her marriage to Elmer collapsed entirely during this period. He hated the newspaper. He hated that Cissy was working at all, but especially that she was working in a way that generated attention and controversy. He told her she was making a spectacle of herself. She told him to leave if he was unhappy. He left in 1929, moving to New York permanently. They did not divorce, neither wanted to deal with the legal complications, but they stopped pretending there was a marriage to maintain. Cissy spent more time at the Herald offices than at home. The paper became the place where she had control, where her decisions mattered, where people did what she told them to do or lost their jobs. It was not happiness, but it was power, and power felt better than the helplessness she had lived with during the custody battle. She began writing a column under a pseudonym. The column was gossipy, personal, filled with observations about Washington society that only someone inside that world could make. She wrote about the wives of politicians, the daughters of wealthy families, the social hierarchies that determined who mattered and who did not. The column was popular because it was mean in ways that felt honest. Cissy understood how shallow and transactional her world was, and she was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. Her brother Joe worried about her. He came to Washington occasionally and took her to dinner, trying to convince her to ease up, to stop using the paper as a weapon. He told her she was burning bridges, that she would end up isolated, that revenge was not the same as purpose. Cissy listened and ignored him. Joe had the Tribune. He had sons who would inherit it. He had a life that made sense. Cissy had the Herald, and nothing else, and she was not going to run it gently. In 1930, Hearst offered to sell her the paper outright. The price was considerable, but Cissy had the money from her mother's estate and her own investments. She bought the Washington Herald in August 1930. It was hers completely. No partners, no oversight, no one to answer to except herself. Ownership changed something. The paper was no longer just a job or a distraction. It was hers in the same way nothing else in her life had ever been hers. Not her marriages, not her daughter, not the houses she had lived in, or the money she had inherited. The Herald was the first thing she controlled completely. She stood in the offices the day after the purchase finalized, looking at the printing presses, the desks where journalists worked, the stacks of papers ready for distribution. She was 48 years old. She had failed at almost everything she had tried, but she owned a newspaper in the nation's capital, and that meant she owned a kind of power that had nothing to do with beauty or marriage or social approval. It was not enough to fix what was broken, but it was enough to make sure other people understood she could not be dismissed anymore. Owning the Herald outright removed any remaining restraints on Cissy's editorial decisions. There was no longer a publisher to question her judgment, no financial partner to demand caution. The paper became an extension of her moods, her grudges, her increasingly rigid political views. What had started as sharp coverage of Washington society hardened into something more vindictive. She expanded the paper's reach. She hired more reporters, increased the page count, pushed circulation into neighborhoods the Herald had previously ignored. The business side was thriving. Revenue increased year after year. But the content became more erratic, reflecting Cissy's obsessions rather than any coherent editorial strategy. One obsession was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter and a fixture of Washington society. Alice was everything Cissy had once wanted to be: confident, cutting, politically connected, genuinely powerful in ways that had nothing to do with marriage. They had been friendly once, moving through the same circles, attending the same parties. But at some point in the late 1920s, Alice had made a comment about Cissy at a dinner party. The comment was repeated to Cissy, likely exaggerated. Something about divorced women who confused running a newspaper with having actual influence. Cissy never confronted Alice directly. Instead, she used the Herald. Small items started appearing in the society pages, mentions of Alice's attendance at events, always with subtle implications that she was past her prime, that her opinions were no longer as relevant as she believed, that she was clinging to her father's legacy because she had none of her own. The coverage was petty and obvious, and everyone in Washington recognized it as personal. Alice fought back using her own connections and her sharper wit. She made jokes about Cissy at parties, called her the Countess, in tones that made the title sound ridiculous, suggested that owning a newspaper did not make someone a journalist any more than owning a horse made someone a jockey. The feud became public entertainment for Washington society. Two wealthy women using whatever weapons they had to hurt each other for reasons neither would clearly articulate. The Herald's coverage of politics became more ideological during this period. Cissy had always been conservative, but by the early 1930s her conservatism had curdled into something harder. She opposed Roosevelt's New Deal programs with a fury that seemed disproportionate. The Herald ran editorials attacking government spending, relief programs, anything that suggested the federal government should intervene in economic matters. Her reporters were expected to find stories that supported her positions. She killed stories that contradicted them. When journalists pushed back, she reminded them who owned the paper. Several resigned. Others stayed and learned to write what Cissy wanted, adjusting facts to fit narratives, emphasizing details that served the Herald's editorial line while burying details that complicated it. She wrote increasingly frequent columns under her own name now, abandoning the pseudonym. The columns were angry, personal, often directed at specific individuals. She attacked New Deal officials by name. She questioned their competence, their motives, their backgrounds. When readers complained that the coverage was biased, she published their letters alongside responses that mocked them. One target was Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor and the first woman in a presidential cabinet. Perkins represented something Cissy despised, a woman wielding actual political power, not through marriage or inheritance, but through competence and appointment. The Herald ran articles questioning Perkins's policies, her judgment, her qualifications. Cissy wrote columns suggesting that Perkins was out of her depth, that she was a token appointment, that her gender made her unsuitable for the position. The irony of a woman using her newspaper to undermine another woman's political authority was not lost on observers. But Cissy did not care. She saw Perkins as part of a government apparatus she opposed, and opposition meant total warfare. The fact that Perkins had achieved something Cissy never could legitimate power earned through work rather than purchased with inheritance, likely intensified the hostility, though Cissy would never have admitted it. Her personal life continued to deteriorate. She lived alone in an apartment, then in a townhouse, surrounded by staff who were paid to be present, but not to care. She had acquaintances, but few friends. The people who might have been friends had either been driven away by the Herald's coverage or had stopped calling because spending time with Cissy meant potentially becoming material for her next column. She drank heavily. The drinking had started years earlier, but accelerated after she bought the paper. Scotch, mostly, consumed in the evenings after leaving the Herald offices, sometimes during the afternoons as well. The staff at the newspaper learned to recognize the signs, her handwriting becoming less controlled, her editorial decisions more impulsive, her anger at small problems escalating into tirades. She fired people frequently: a reporter who missed a deadline, an editor who placed a story on the wrong page, a secretary who made an error in correspondence. Some of the firings were reversed the next day when Cissy was calmer, but the atmosphere at the Herald became tense. Employees never knew which version of Cissy would arrive each morning: the focused businesswoman who asked sharp questions, or the drunk woman who screamed about minor mistakes. Her relationship with Felicia remained fractured. Felicia was an adult now, married, living in Europe. The supervised visits had ended, replaced by occasional letters that were polite and empty. Felicia never mentioned Joseph, who was still alive and still living somewhere in Poland. Cissy had stopped trying to repair the relationship. The effort required more hope than she could manage. In 1933, Joseph died. Cissy learned about it weeks after the fact, from a letter from one of Felicia's relatives. There was no funeral she was invited to, no acknowledgement that she had been his wife or had any claim to grief. Joseph's death changed nothing. Felicia did not suddenly want a relationship with her mother. The years of separation had done their work. Cissy was simply a woman who had given birth to her, not a mother in any meaningful sense. The Herald published a brief obituary noting Joseph's title and his estates in Poland. Cissy did not write anything personal. She did not attend any memorial. She sat in her office the day she received the news and felt nothing except a vague sense that the custody battle had been permanent in ways the divorce never was. By 1935, the Herald was one of the most profitable papers in Washington, and Cissy was one of the most influential and most disliked figures in the city. She had power, she had money, she had control over a major newspaper, and she used all of it to wage small wars against people who had slighted her, to promote political positions that grew more rigid every year, and to fill the space where a life might have been. She was 53 years old. She had spent 2 decades building toward this position, and now that she had it, she discovered that power was just another kind of loneliness, performed in public. Felicia had been 7 years old when Joseph took her back to Europe in 1910. By the time she was grown, she had spent more of her life with her father than with her mother, and the woman who appeared occasionally for supervised visits was essentially a stranger who brought expensive gifts and asked questions Felicia had no interest in answering. Cissy tried to maintain connection through letters. She wrote to Felicia monthly, sometimes more often, describing her life in Washington, asking about school, attempting to create a relationship through paper and ink. Felicia's responses were brief and formal. She answered direct questions with minimal detail. She never asked her mother anything personal. The letters read like correspondence between distant relatives fulfilling an obligation neither particularly wanted. In 1923, when Felicia was 17, Cissy arranged for her to visit Washington for several weeks. It was the longest time they had spent together since the kidnapping. Cissy prepared obsessively, redecorating a bedroom in her house, planning activities, making lists of things they could do together. She wanted Felicia to see that she had been wrong about her mother, that Cissy was not the villain Joseph had described, that there could still be some kind of relationship. The visit was a failure from the first day. Felicia arrived speaking better French than English. She was polite in the distant way of someone enduring an unpleasant but necessary social obligation. When Cissy tried to have conversations, Felicia answered in monosyllables. When Cissy suggested activities, shopping, theater, dinners with interesting people, Felicia complied without enthusiasm. Cissy noticed that Felicia flinched at sudden movements, that she became quiet when voices were raised, that she had a way of disappearing into herself during conflicts. These were recognizable behaviors. Cissy had learned them herself during her marriage to Joseph. She understood that her daughter had grown up in the same house of violence Cissy had escaped from, and that Felicia had not escaped. She tried to talk about it. One evening carefully, she asked Felicia about her father, about what life had been like in Poland and Russia, about whether Joseph had been kind to her. Felicia's face closed immediately. She said her father had provided everything she needed. She said she was grateful for her education and her upbringing. She said nothing that answered the actual question. Cissy pushed slightly. She mentioned that she knew what Joseph was capable of, that she had left because of his violence, that she had fought for custody because she wanted to protect Felicia from exactly what had apparently happened anyway. Felicia stood up and left the room. She did not return for hours. When she came back, she acted as though the conversation had never occurred. The visit ended early. Felicia claimed she had obligations back in Europe, though Cissy suspected she simply wanted to leave. They said goodbye at the train station. Cissy tried to embrace her daughter. Felicia tolerated the embrace the way one might tolerate an unpleasant medical procedure. Necessary, perhaps, but not something to be prolonged. Then she boarded the train, and Cissy stood on the platform watching it depart, understanding that she had lost her daughter in ways that had nothing to do with custody arrangements. In 1925, Felicia married a man named Drew Pearson. He was an American journalist, ambitious and well-connected. Cissy learned about the engagement from a letter that arrived 3 weeks before the wedding. The letter was brief. Felicia was getting married. The ceremony would be in Europe. She hoped her mother understood that it would be a small affair, family only, and that travel would be difficult. Cissy was not invited to her own daughter's wedding. She sat with that letter for a long time. She had spent years fighting Joseph for custody. She had spent a fortune on lawyers. She had traveled across Europe searching for her stolen child. And now Felicia was getting married, and Cissy would not be there, because her daughter had decided that the man who kidnapped her was family, and the woman who gave birth to her was not. Cissy sent an expensive gift, silver purchased from a jeweler in New York, engraved with Felicia's new initials. The thank you note she received in return was polite and empty. Drew Pearson became a prominent political columnist. His work brought him to Washington frequently, which meant Felicia was sometimes in the city as well. Cissy would learn about these visits secondhand, someone mentioning at a party that they had seen Drew and Felicia at a restaurant, or that the couple had attended a reception. Felicia did not contact her mother during these visits. She was in Washington, sometimes staying for weeks, and she did not call. Cissy saw her daughter occasionally at public events. They would end up at the same party or benefit, and there would be a moment where they noticed each other across the room. Sometimes they spoke briefly, surface-level exchanges about weather or mutual acquaintances, conversations that could have happened between any two people who barely knew each other. Then Felicia would find a reason to move elsewhere, and Cissy would stand alone, holding a drink, watching her daughter laugh with other people. By the 1930s, Cissy had stopped trying. She had accepted that whatever relationship might have been possible was dead. Felicia had been poisoned against her, by Joseph, by time, by the fact that Cissy had left her in Poland even though leaving her had not been a choice. The logic did not matter. The result was the same. Drew Pearson's political columns sometimes criticized positions the Herald promoted. His work appeared in competing papers, and his views were generally more liberal than Cissy's. She could have used the Herald to attack him. She could have assigned reporters to investigate his background, to look for scandals, to undermine his credibility the way she had undermined so many others who had crossed her. She never did. Drew Pearson remained untouched by the Herald's usual viciousness. It was the only restraint Cissy showed during her years as editor. This one decision not to destroy her daughter's husband, even though they were on opposite sides of most issues, even though he represented everything she opposed politically. She never explained this decision to anyone. She never acknowledged it, but the staff at the Herald noticed. When Drew Pearson's name came up in editorial meetings, when reporters suggested stories that would target him, Cissy would change the subject or kill the story without explanation. It was the only evidence that somewhere beneath the vindictiveness and the drinking and the rage, there remained some small piece of Cissy that still thought of Felicia as her daughter and wanted to protect her, even if protection meant nothing more than not actively harming her marriage. In 1936, Felicia had a child, a daughter. Cissy learned about it from a birth announcement in another newspaper. She sent a gift, a silver rattle, expensive and impersonal. She received no acknowledgement. She did not know if Felicia had even opened the package. She became a grandmother without being allowed to be one. There would be no visits, no requests to babysit, no photographs sent in letters. The child would grow up not knowing Cissy existed, or knowing only as a name mentioned in family stories, a distant figure with a scandalous past who owned a newspaper and drank too much. Cissy kept a photograph of Felicia on her desk at the Herald offices. It was from the 1923 visit, one of the few times someone had convinced both of them to pose for a camera. Felicia looked uncomfortable. Cissy looked desperate. Neither was smiling in a way that suggested happiness. The photograph sat on the desk for years, collecting dust, a reminder of the one thing Cissy's money and power had been completely unable to fix. The stock market crashed in October 1929. By 1930, bread lines stretched through Washington's streets. Families who had been stable lost their homes. Men who had worked for decades found themselves without jobs, standing in lines for soup distributed by charities that were quickly overwhelmed. The economy had collapsed in ways that made previous downturns look minor. Cissy's wealth remained untouched. The Patterson family fortune was diversified across newspapers, real estate, and investments managed by people whose job was protecting money from disasters that destroyed everyone else. The Herald's revenue declined slightly as businesses cut advertising budgets, but the paper remained profitable. Cissy's personal income continued at levels most Americans could not imagine in good times, let alone during the Depression. She moved into a larger house in 1931. The previous residence had felt cramped, though it had 15 rooms. The new property was a mansion on DuPont Circle, 60 rooms spread across multiple floors, with formal gardens and quarters for a full staff. The renovations cost a fortune. Cissy hired architects, decorators, craftsmen imported from Europe. She had specific ideas about what she wanted: marble from Italy, wood paneling from England, furniture custom made by designers who worked for royalty. The work took months. While families in Washington boiled water to make soup stretch further, while children wore shoes with holes because their parents could not afford replacements, Cissy stood in her new mansion arguing with contractors about the exact shade of paint for a bedroom she would barely use. She threw parties. Not small dinner parties, but events that required professional caterers, orchestras, decorations that took days to install. She invited politicians, journalists, foreign diplomats, anyone whose presence might be useful or entertaining. The guest lists were carefully curated. People who had criticized her were excluded. People who might be valuable in the future were included even if she disliked them. The parties were excessive in ways that felt deliberate. 7-course meals when people outside were hungry. Champagne and imported wines flowing freely when families were rationing milk. Live music and entertainment, while the unemployment rate climbed past 20%. Cissy was not oblivious to the contrast. She read the Herald's own coverage of the Depression. She saw the photographs of bread lines. She simply did not care enough to alter her behavior. The Herald, under her ownership, covered the Depression extensively. Reporters wrote about unemployment, about failed banks, about the human cost of economic collapse. The coverage was detailed and often sympathetic to people suffering. But the editorial page, which Cissy controlled directly, blamed Roosevelt's policies for making things worse. She argued that government intervention was prolonging the crisis, that relief programs were creating dependency, that the solution was less regulation and more faith in markets that had just destroyed millions of lives. The contradiction was obvious. The Herald's news pages showed the Depression's devastation, while the opinion pages argued against helping the devastated. Cissy saw no problem with this. She believed in journalism as reporting facts and editorials as expressing opinion, and her opinion was that the government should stay out of economic matters even as those economic matters were causing mass suffering. She hired servants who were desperate for any work. The mansion required a large staff: cooks, maids, groundskeepers, drivers, people to maintain rooms that were rarely entered. Cissy paid them, which was more than many employers were doing. But the wages were low and the expectations were rigid. She wanted the house to run perfectly, wanted meals prepared exactly as specified, wanted every surface cleaned, wanted the staff to be invisible unless she needed something. Several of the servants had families, children to feed, parents dependent on their income. Cissy knew this in the abstract way one knows facts that do not affect decisions. When a maid asked for an advance on her salary because her daughter needed medicine, Cissy said no. Rules were rules. When a cook requested time off to help his wife who was ill, Cissy denied it because she was hosting a dinner party that week. The staff learned not to ask for accommodations. She bought clothes during this period that cost more than some families earned in a year. Dresses from Paris, shoes from Italy, furs that required killing dozens of animals. She wore them to parties and events, then often never wore them again. Her closets filled with garments purchased on impulse and forgotten. In 1932, veterans marched on Washington demanding early payment of bonuses they had been promised for their service in World War I. They were broke, desperate, many of them homeless. They set up camps in the city and petitioned the government for help. The Bonus Army, they called themselves, men who had fought for their country and now needed their country to fight for them. The Herald covered the march with skepticism. Cissy's editorials suggested the veterans were being manipulated by communist agitators, that their demands were unreasonable, that paying the bonuses early would bankrupt the government. When federal troops eventually drove the veterans out of their camps using tear gas and bayonets, burning their makeshift shelters, the Herald editorial page supported the action as necessary to maintain order. Cissy watched none of this firsthand. She read reports from her journalists and made editorial decisions from her office or from her mansion. The veterans were abstractions to her, problems to have opinions about rather than human beings suffering consequences of decisions made by people like her family. She traveled during these years, not despite the Depression, but seemingly indifferent to it. She went to New York regularly, staying in expensive hotels, dining at restaurants where meals cost what many families had to live on for a week. She visited Palm Beach in winter, where wealthy people gathered to pretend the economic collapse was not happening. She spent weeks in Wyoming at a ranch she had purchased, land that stretched for thousands of acres, while farmers elsewhere were losing their land to banks. The ranch was her escape from Washington. She hired cowboys to manage the cattle. She had a house built there, large and comfortable, stocked with everything she might need during her visits. She rode horses across property that was entirely hers, land where she could go days without seeing another person if she chose. The isolation felt like luxury rather than loneliness when it was chosen and temporary. Her brother Joe criticized her lifestyle during one of his visits to Washington in 1934. He told her she was being reckless, that flaunting wealth during the Depression was creating resentment, that people noticed when newspaper editors lived like aristocrats while writing editorials about fiscal responsibility. Cissy told him to mind his own business. She had earned her money, or inherited it, which was the same thing. She would spend it however she wanted. Joe pointed out that she had not earned anything, that she had been born into wealth and had done nothing except exist to maintain it. The argument escalated. Cissy told Joe to leave. He left. They did not speak for months. The parties continued, the renovations continued, the excess continued, and every day the Herald published articles about the Depression's toll, while Cissy lived in a mansion that exemplified everything that had gone wrong, making decisions about coverage of poverty while wearing jewelry that could have fed a neighborhood. By the mid-1930s, Cissy's political views had hardened into certainties she was willing to force onto every page of the Herald. The paper had always reflected her conservatism, but after 1935 it became something more aggressive, a propaganda instrument aimed at undermining Roosevelt's presidency and preventing American involvement in the conflicts building in Europe. She despised Roosevelt personally. Part of it was political. She opposed the New Deal, government expansion. Anything that suggested wealth should be regulated or redistributed. But part of it was more visceral. Roosevelt represented a kind of confidence and popularity that Cissy could never achieve. People loved him despite his aristocratic background, perhaps because he had transformed that background into empathy for people suffering. Cissy had the same aristocratic background and had transformed it into contempt. The Herald's editorials attacked Roosevelt daily. They questioned his competence, his motives, his character. They suggested he was leading America towards socialism, that his programs were destroying individual liberty, that he was accumulating dangerous levels of power. Some of the criticism was legitimate policy disagreement. Much of it was personal hatred dressed in political language. Cissy wrote many of the editorials herself. Her writing became more heated as the years passed, less concerned with persuasion and more focused on expressing rage. She called Roosevelt a dictator. She compared New Deal programs to fascism, ignoring that actual fascism was rising in Europe and looked nothing like unemployment insurance. She published cartoons that depicted the president as a tyrant, a fool, a puppet controlled by advisors she particularly despised. The attacks extended to Eleanor Roosevelt. Cissy had known Eleanor socially for years. They had attended some of the same events, moved through overlapping circles. But Eleanor as First Lady represented everything Cissy found threatening. A woman with actual political influence, using that influence to advocate for people Cissy believed should help themselves. The Herald ran articles questioning Eleanor's activities, her public statements, her involvement in policy discussions. The coverage was mean in ways that revealed how much Cissy resented a woman who had found purpose beyond social position. In 1937, Cissy merged the Herald with another Hearst paper to create the Washington Times-Herald. The merger gave her more resources, wider circulation, greater influence. She used all of it to intensify her political crusade. The Times-Herald became the most stridently anti-Roosevelt paper in Washington, and Washington was full of papers critical of the president. The paper's coverage of international events reflected Cissy's isolationism. As tensions increased in Europe, Hitler's rise in Germany, the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini's ambitions in Italy, the Times-Herald argued consistently that America should stay out of foreign conflicts. Cissy believed that European wars were European problems, that American involvement in World War I had been a mistake, that the country should focus on domestic issues rather than international entanglements. The position was not uncommon. Many Americans in the 1930s were isolationist, skeptical of foreign wars, worried about being drawn into conflicts that did not concern them. But Cissy's isolationism went beyond skepticism. It became an obsession. Every editorial about foreign policy argued for American neutrality. Every news story was framed to emphasize the dangers of intervention. Reporters who suggested that Nazi Germany might pose a genuine threat found their stories killed or rewritten. Charles Lindbergh became one of Cissy's heroes during this period. Lindbergh was famous for flying across the Atlantic, but by the late 1930s he was more famous for his isolationist speeches and his troubling statements about Nazi Germany. He argued that Germany's military power made resistance futile, that America should seek accommodation rather than confrontation, that certain racial groups were better suited to govern than others. The Times-Herald covered Lindbergh's speeches extensively and favorably. Cissy invited him to her parties. She published his writings. When critics pointed out Lindbergh's Nazi sympathies, his acceptance of a medal from Hermann Göring, his statements that sounded uncomfortably close to Nazi racial theories, Cissy dismissed the concerns. She claimed Lindbergh was being smeared by interventionists who wanted to drag America into war. The Times-Herald ran editorials defending him, attacking his critics, suggesting that opposition to Lindbergh was really opposition to peace. Her brother Joe disagreed profoundly with her position. The Chicago Tribune had its own isolationist tendencies, but Joe was more nuanced, more willing to acknowledge that Hitler represented a genuine threat. He visited Cissy in 1938 and tried to convince her to moderate the Times-Herald's coverage. He told her she was damaging her credibility, that defending Lindbergh made her look sympathetic to fascism, that she was on the wrong side of history. They argued for hours. Cissy refused to concede anything. She told Joe he had been corrupted by East Coast interventionists, that he had forgotten what journalism was supposed to be, that the Tribune had become soft under his leadership. Joe told her she was letting her hatred of Roosevelt cloud her judgment about Hitler. Cissy told him to leave her house. He did. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The war Cissy had insisted America should avoid was now undeniable. The Times-Herald's coverage remained isolationist. Editorials argued that Poland's fate was tragic, but not America's responsibility, that Europe's wars had been going on for centuries and would continue regardless of American involvement, that the best thing America could do was stay neutral and protect its own interests. The paper published letters from readers who agreed with this position. Letters from readers who disagreed were either not published or printed alongside editorials that mocked them. Cissy had never pretended the Times-Herald was objective, but by 1939 it had become so one-sided that even some of her own staff were uncomfortable. Several journalists quit. They told Cissy privately that they could not continue working for a paper that seemed more interested in propaganda than truth. She let them go without argument. There were plenty of reporters willing to write what she wanted, especially during the Depression when jobs were scarce. By 1940, as Germany conquered France and began bombing Britain, the Times-Herald's position became increasingly untenable. Most Americans still opposed entering the war, but they were beginning to understand that neutrality might not be possible. Roosevelt began preparing the country for potential involvement, expanding military production, instituting a draft, providing aid to Britain. Cissy opposed all of it. Every measure Roosevelt proposed to strengthen defense, the Times-Herald attacked. Every step towards supporting Britain, the paper characterized as warmongering. Cissy genuinely believed she was defending American interests. She saw herself as one of the few people willing to resist the push toward war, a voice of sanity against hysteria. But her opposition was making her irrelevant. The world was changing in ways her wealth and her newspaper could not prevent. America was moving toward war despite her editorials, despite her political connections, despite the Times-Herald's daily arguments for isolationism. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II the next day. Everything Cissy had spent years arguing against happened anyway. The Times-Herald had to shift its coverage overnight, from opposing intervention to supporting the war effort, from attacking Roosevelt's foreign policy to defending it. Cissy continued publishing the paper. She continued writing editorials. But something had broken. She had spent years using the Times-Herald to fight a political battle she was certain she could win through force of will and repetition. She had been wrong. The war had come. Her crusade had failed. And the paper that had been her weapon now felt like evidence of her misjudgment, preserved in archives for anyone who wanted to see how badly she had misread the world. By the 1940s, Cissy owned multiple properties, each more elaborate than most people would occupy in a lifetime. The DuPont Circle mansion in Washington was the primary residence. 60 rooms filled with furniture she had imported from Europe, art she had purchased from dealers who understood what wealthy clients wanted to hear about provenance and value. The house required a staff of 15 to maintain. People who cleaned rooms Cissy never entered, polished silver she rarely used, prepared meals she sometimes skipped because she was drinking instead. The mansion had been designed for entertaining, for hosting the kind of parties that would establish Cissy as a social force in Washington. She had thrown those parties in the early years of ownership. Hundreds of guests, orchestras, decorations, food prepared by chefs brought in specifically for the events. But by the 1940s, the parties had diminished, partly because of the war. Large social gatherings felt inappropriate when people were dying overseas, mostly because Cissy had alienated too many people. The guest lists had shrunk. The people who still accepted her invitations came for professional reasons or curiosity, not friendship. The house echoed. Cissy would sit in the library at night drinking and hear footsteps from servants moving through distant hallways. She would hear doors closing in parts of the mansion she had not visited in weeks. The space that was supposed to demonstrate her success instead demonstrated how alone she was. 60 rooms, and she occupied perhaps 3 of them regularly: the bedroom, the library, the dining room where she ate meals by herself, while staff stood against the walls waiting to clear plates. She had a country estate in Maryland called Dower House. The property covered hundreds of acres, with forests and fields, and a main house that was smaller than the DuPont Circle mansion, but still substantial. She had purchased it in the 1930s as a retreat from Washington, a place where she could escape the city when the politics and the social obligations became too exhausting. But Dower House became another empty space. She would go there for weekends, sometimes for weeks at a time, and the isolation that was supposed to be restorative felt instead like confinement. The house had the same problem as the mansion: too much space, too few people, rooms decorated for a life she was not living. She would walk through the property alone, occasionally riding horses she kept stabled there, and the beauty of the land did nothing to fill the fundamental emptiness. The staff at Dower House was smaller than in Washington, but they maintained the same careful distance. They were employees, not companions. They prepared meals she requested, maintained the grounds, ensured everything functioned properly. They did not speak to her unless spoken to. They did not ask questions about why she spent so much time staring out windows or why she sometimes went days without leaving the house. In Wyoming, she owned a ranch that stretched across thousands of acres. She had purchased it years earlier, attracted by the idea of the American West, the fantasy of wide-open spaces and independence. The main house there was built in a rustic style that was meant to look simple but had cost a fortune to construct. Logs imported from specific forests, stone from particular quarries, furniture made by craftsmen who specialized in expensive approximations of frontier living. She visited the ranch occasionally, usually in summer. The trips required extensive planning, staff traveling ahead to prepare the house, supplies shipped from cities because the ranch was too remote for convenient shopping. She would arrive and spend weeks in isolation that was supposed to feel like freedom, but mostly felt like more empty rooms in a different landscape. The ranch hands maintained the property and managed the cattle Cissy owned but never saw. They were polite when she spoke to them, respectful in the way employees were respectful to wealthy people who controlled their income. But there was no real interaction. Cissy was the owner. They were workers. The distance between those positions was too great for conversation beyond logistics. She would ride alone across the property, covering miles without seeing another person. The scale of the land was impressive. Mountains in the distance, valleys stretching for miles, sky that seemed larger than in Washington. But the beauty could not compensate for the fact that she was riding through it alone, that there was no one to share the experience with, that all the acres she owned did not add up to company. The houses shared certain features. They were all too large. They were all maintained by staff who were paid to maintain them. They were all filled with objects that demonstrated wealth, art, furniture, decorations purchased because they were expensive rather than because Cissy particularly liked them. And they were all fundamentally empty of anything that mattered. She collected things during this period, art that dealers assured her was valuable. First editions of books she would never read, furniture with historical significance she did not care about. The objects accumulated in the houses, filling rooms, creating the appearance of a life filled with culture and taste. But the collection was compulsive rather than passionate. She bought things because buying things was what wealthy people did, because filling the houses with objects made them feel less empty, even though the emptiness remained. Friends were scarce by the 1940s. The people who had been friendly in earlier decades had drifted away or been driven away by the Times-Herald's vindictiveness or Cissy's drinking or the general unpleasantness of spending time with someone who was angry about everything. She had acquaintances, other wealthy people she saw at events, professional contacts through the newspaper, but no one called just to talk. No one visited without a purpose. Her brother Joe had died in 1946, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. Cissy learned about it through a phone call from Joe's wife. She attended the funeral in Chicago, standing among family members she barely knew, listening to speeches about Joe's accomplishments and character. She cried, though she was not certain whether she was crying for Joe or for herself, for the loss of the only person who had known her since childhood, who remembered what she had been before the marriages and the newspaper and the decades of accumulated bitterness. After Joe's death, the houses felt even emptier. There was no one left who shared her history, no one who could remember their grandfather, their parents, the Chicago house where they had grown up. Cissy was the last one who knew those stories, and when she died, the stories would die with her. She began spending more time in the DuPont Circle library, drinking through evenings, sometimes through entire days. The staff knew not to disturb her during these periods. They would leave food outside the library door. Sometimes she ate it. Often she did not. The drinking was not social. There was no one to drink with. It was solitary, methodical, a way of making hours pass in a life that had too many hours and not enough meaning. The houses stood as monuments to what wealth could purchase: space, privacy, beauty, objects that other people could not afford. But they could not purchase company. They could not purchase family that wanted to visit. They could not purchase the sense that these enormous properties were homes rather than expensive containers for a woman who had everything except reasons to care about any of it. The drinking had always been present, but by the mid-1940s it had become the organizing principle of Cissy's days. She started in the afternoons now, sometimes earlier. Scotch, mostly, poured into crystal glasses by herself or by staff who had learned not to comment. The first drink made the edges softer. The second made the anger more manageable. By the third, the emptiness felt less oppressive, though it never actually went away. She still went to the Times-Herald offices, but less reliably. Some mornings she would wake with intentions of working, of engaging with the paper the way she had in earlier years. But the effort required to dress, to present herself as competent, to make decisions that mattered, it felt increasingly impossible. She would pour a drink instead, telling herself she would go in later. Later became evening. Evening became not going at all. The staff at the newspaper learned to function without her. Editors made decisions they would previously have brought to Cissy. Reporters pursued stories without her approval. The paper continued publishing, though it lacked the vicious energy that had characterized it during her most active years. Without Cissy's daily involvement, the Times-Herald became more conventional, less personal, just another newspaper in a city full of them. When she did appear at the offices, the staff could usually tell she had been drinking. Her movements were careful in the way drunk people moved when trying to appear sober. Her speech was slightly imprecise. Her editorial decisions were erratic, sometimes sharp and insightful, sometimes incomprehensible. The younger reporters, ones who had been hired recently and did not remember Cissy at her most formidable, whispered about whether she should still be running the paper. Her health deteriorated. The drinking caused obvious problems: weight fluctuations, poor sleep, mornings when she could barely function until the shaking stopped. But there were other issues that the doctors she occasionally consulted said were related to years of stress and poor self-care. Her heart was weak. Her liver was struggling. She had chronic pain that no one could adequately diagnose or treat. She took pills for some of it, mixing them with alcohol in combinations that made the doctors uncomfortable when they found out. She fell several times in the DuPont Circle mansion, once coming down the stairs, catching herself on the railing before she tumbled all the way down. Once in her bedroom, hitting her head on furniture hard enough that staff found her unconscious on the floor. The servants called doctors who recommended rest and supervision and reducing her alcohol consumption. Cissy ignored all of it. The isolation intensified. She stopped accepting most invitations, partly because fewer people were inviting her, partly because she had no interest in maintaining appearances. The parties she had once used to demonstrate her social position now felt exhausting. The idea of dressing appropriately, of making conversation, of pretending she cared about anything people discussed. It was too much effort for too little reward. She ate irregularly. The staff prepared meals, but Cissy often skipped them, drinking instead. When she did eat, it was usually small amounts without real appetite. She lost weight in ways that made her clothes hang loosely. Her face changed, the bone structure becoming more prominent, the skin taking on the gray cast of someone whose body was struggling. There were brief periods of clarity when she would recognize what was happening and attempt to regain control. She would stop drinking for a few days, force herself to go to the Times-Herald offices, try to engage with work the way she once had. But the clarity never lasted. Something would trigger the anger or the grief or the overwhelming sense that nothing mattered, and she would return to the library and the scotch and the numbness that felt better than feeling. Her relationship with Felicia remained non-existent. They had not spoken in years. Cissy knew her daughter was living somewhere on the East Coast, that she had children now, that Drew Pearson's career continued to thrive. But this knowledge came from newspapers and gossip, not from any direct communication. Felicia had made clear that she wanted no relationship with her mother. Cissy had stopped fighting it. The grief over losing her daughter had been replaced by a dull acceptance that some losses were permanent. She thought about death increasingly, not in actively suicidal ways, but with a kind of resigned acknowledgement that death would be a relief. She was in her 60s now, and everything hurt, physically, emotionally, in ways that alcohol could dull, but not eliminate. She had no reason to believe the future would be better than the present. The newspaper would continue, or it would not. Her properties would pass to whoever inherited them. Her life had already happened, and what remained was just the slow process of running down. The nighttime was worst. She would lie in bed in the mansion, hearing the house settle, hearing traffic from the street, hearing nothing from within because there was no one else there who mattered. The staff had their quarters, but they were not company. They were employees who maintained the property and collected their wages and went home when their shifts ended, leaving Cissy alone in 60 rooms that felt like a prison she had built for herself. She had nightmares about Joseph sometimes, not frequent, but often enough that she dreaded sleep. In the dreams, he would be chasing her, or she would be back at Novoselica unable to leave, or she would be watching him take Felicia and be unable to stop him. She would wake up confused about what year it was, what house she was in, whether the marriage was still happening or had ended decades ago. The confusion would last for minutes before clarity returned, and she remembered that Joseph was dead, that the marriage was long over, but that the damage it had caused remained. In 1947, she began giving away some of her possessions, not systematically, not with any clear plan, but in impulsive gestures that seemed to confuse the recipients. She gave expensive jewelry to staff members who were startled by the gifts and unsure whether to accept them. She donated art to museums, pieces she had owned for years without particularly noticing. She sold furniture, had it removed from the mansion, and sent to auction houses that handled estates. The staff wondered if she was preparing for death. Cissy did not explain. She simply wanted less, fewer objects, fewer responsibilities, fewer things that required attention or maintenance or decisions about what to do with them. Her brother Joe's widow contacted her occasionally, dutiful letters about family matters. Cissy responded briefly when she remembered, but maintaining correspondence required energy she did not have. The letters from Joe's widow became less frequent, then stopped. Cissy did not notice their absence for several months. By early 1948, Cissy was spending most of her time in the DuPont Circle mansion, in the library or her bedroom, with bottles nearby and staff checking periodically to ensure she was still breathing. The Times-Herald functioned without her. The properties were maintained by people she paid. The investments generated income whether she paid attention or not. Her life had become a waiting room where nothing happened except the passage of time, and even time felt slow and heavy and meaningless. She was 66 years old. She had been wealthy her entire life. She had married twice, owned a major newspaper, lived in houses most people would never enter, and none of it had protected her from ending up alone, sick, drinking herself toward an end that would come as relief. In the final years of her life, Cissy began making charitable donations with a frequency that surprised people who knew her. The woman who had spent decades accumulating wealth and wielding it primarily as a weapon suddenly started giving it away. Large sums to hospitals, universities, veterans organizations, children's charities. The gifts were substantial enough that they required legal arrangements, meetings with lawyers and accountants who managed the transfers. The recipients were grateful. They sent thank you letters, invited Cissy to recognition events, offered to name buildings or programs after her. Some accepted, some declined. But the money itself was always welcome, especially in the post-war years when institutions were rebuilding and expanding and desperate for funding from anyone willing to provide it. The question no one asked directly was why? Why now, after decades of using wealth primarily for personal comfort and political influence, was Cissy suddenly concerned with helping others? The charitable organizations did not care about her motives. Money was money regardless of what prompted the donation. But people who had known Cissy for years noticed the change and wondered what it meant. Some interpreted it generously. They suggested she was mellowing with age, developing perspective, recognizing that wealth carried responsibilities beyond personal gratification. They spoke about her donations as evidence of growth, of someone becoming more thoughtful in her final years. Others were more skeptical. They noted that the philanthropy began as her health declined, as her drinking became impossible to hide, as her isolation became more obvious. They suggested the donations were attempts to purchase redemption, to create a legacy that was something other than failed marriages and a vindictive newspaper. They questioned whether generosity motivated by desperation counted as generosity at all. Cissy herself never explained. When asked about the donations, she deflected or changed the subject. She did not give speeches about the importance of giving back. She did not write editorials in the Times-Herald, encouraging other wealthy people to follow her example. She simply wrote checks, signed documents, and allowed the money to leave accounts where it had been accumulating for decades. One of the largest donations went to a children's hospital in Washington. The gift funded an entire wing, new construction, modern equipment, resources for treating illnesses that required extended care. The hospital wanted to name the wing after her. Cissy refused initially, then relented when the administrators insisted. The Patterson wing opened in 1946 with a small ceremony that Cissy attended but left early, claiming she felt unwell. She gave money to organizations that helped war veterans transition back to civilian life. The donations were particularly notable given the Times-Herald's isolationist stance before Pearl Harbor, the years of editorials arguing against American involvement in the conflict. Some saw the veteran-focused philanthropy as an acknowledgement that she had been wrong. Others saw it as an attempt to obscure her previous positions, to make people forget what the paper had advocated before the war, made those arguments indefensible. Universities received donations for scholarships, particularly scholarships for women. Cissy endowed funds that would support female students studying journalism. Despite having spent her career in an industry she had entered through wealth and connections rather than education or merit. The scholarships were generous. They helped women who would otherwise have struggled to afford college. But the irony was visible. A woman who had never needed financial aid funding opportunities for women who did. The staff at her properties benefited from sudden generosity. Servants who had worked for her for years received unexpected bonuses, gifts of money large enough to change their circumstances. Some were able to pay off debts, some bought houses, some simply saved it, uncertain whether Cissy's generosity would continue or whether this was a temporary impulse that would reverse. But the generosity felt impersonal. Cissy did not spend time with the people she was helping. She did not visit the hospital wing she had funded to see the children being treated there. She did not meet the scholarship recipients or learn about their lives. She did not ask her staff what they planned to do with the money she gave them. The philanthropy was transactional, money moving from her accounts to other people and organizations, creating change in their lives while leaving hers fundamentally unchanged. There were no requirements attached to most of the donations, no demands that recipients acknowledge her publicly, no insistence that they use the money in specific ways. The lack of strings was unusual for someone who had spent her career controlling everything she could control. It suggested that the giving itself was the point, not what came afterward. Because she gave money to organizations that worked with abandoned children. The choice was notable given her own history with Felicia, the daughter she had lost to a custody battle and never reconnected with. The donations funded programs that kept families together, that provided resources for mothers trying to raise children alone, that prevented the kind of parental separation Cissy had experienced. Whether this represented genuine concern or an attempt to address her own guilt through proxy was unclear. Some donations were made anonymously. Cissy would instruct her lawyers to transfer money to organizations without revealing the source. The recipients knew they had received funding, but not from whom. This anonymity complicated the narrative that the philanthropy was about legacy management. If she was trying to improve her reputation, why hide some of the giving? The anonymous donations suggested something more complicated than simple reputation repair. Perhaps she was giving because the money meant nothing to her anymore, because she had enough that giving away millions barely affected her wealth, because spending it on herself had proven pointless. Or perhaps the anonymity was itself strategic, a way to give without the expectation of gratitude, without the burden of being acknowledged, without having to perform generosity in public. Her health continued declining throughout this period. The philanthropy did not slow the deterioration. The money leaving her accounts did not make her less lonely or less dependent on alcohol or less aware that she was dying without having achieved anything that felt meaningful. The donations changed other people's lives. They did not change hers. In early 1948, she established a fund for journalists who were fired for political reasons. The fund would provide financial support to reporters who lost jobs because of their coverage or their positions, protecting them from the kind of economic pressure that forced journalists to self-censor. It was perhaps the most personally relevant donation, an acknowledgement that journalism required protection, that reporters needed independence, that the industry she had been part of had problems money might partially address. But Cissy had also spent years firing journalists at the Times-Herald for political reasons, for writing stories she disagreed with, for failing to support her editorial positions. The fund for journalists felt like an admission that she had been part of the problem she was now trying to solve with money. By mid-1948, she had given away substantial portions of her wealth, not enough to affect her daily life. She still lived in the mansion, still maintained the properties, still had more money than she could spend, but enough that the philanthropy represented a significant transfer of resources from someone who had hoarded them for decades to organizations and people who could use them. Whether this constituted redemption was not a question Cissy seemed interested in answering. She gave the money and continued drinking, continued living alone in houses too large for one person, continued waiting for an end that was approaching whether she was ready or not. By July 1948, Cissy had stopped leaving the DuPont Circle mansion, except when absolutely necessary. The Times-Herald functioned without her presence. The staff managed the property. Lawyers and accountants handled her financial affairs. She existed in the center of all this activity, but separate from it, like a spider that had stopped maintaining its web. Her bedroom was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway, lined with paintings she had purchased decades earlier and no longer looked at. The room itself was large, furnished with expensive pieces that had been selected by decorators who understood what wealthy people were supposed to want. Heavy curtains kept out light. The air was stale. She had stopped allowing staff to open windows, claiming drafts bothered her, though more likely she simply preferred the closed feeling, the sense of being sealed away from everything outside. She spent most of her time in bed or in a chair by the window. The window overlooked the garden, though she rarely actually looked at it. Her attention was mostly internal now, focused on physical discomfort and memories that surfaced without invitation. The present offered nothing interesting. The future was obvious. Only the past remained, and even the past was mostly unpleasant when examined closely. The staff brought meals on trays. She ate small amounts without appetite. The kitchen prepared food according to her previous preferences, but those preferences had been formed when she cared about things like taste and presentation. Now food was just fuel, and she barely needed fuel because she was barely moving. The drinking continued, but had changed character. She was not getting drunk in the purposeful way she had in earlier years, using alcohol to achieve numbness or relief. Now she drank because her body expected it, because not drinking meant shaking and nausea and discomfort worse than what the drinking caused. She sipped scotch throughout the day, maintaining a level that kept withdrawal at bay without providing any real pleasure. Her doctor visited occasionally. He took her pulse, listened to her heart, made notes about her declining condition. He recommended hospitalization. She refused. He suggested treatments, medications, changes to her routine that might slow the deterioration. She nodded as though agreeing, then ignored all of it after he left. He told her privately, during one visit in June, that her heart was failing. Not immediately, but soon, weeks or months, probably not longer. She asked if it would be painful. He said probably not. More likely she would simply weaken until one day her heart stopped. She thanked him for his honesty. He left looking uncomfortable, as doctors always did when wealthy patients treated their own deaths as logistical problems rather than tragedies. She made no preparations, no final letters to Felicia, who would not want them anyway, no detailed instructions about the properties or the newspaper, no dramatic deathbed statements. She had already distributed some of her wealth through the philanthropy. The rest would be handled by executors according to legal documents prepared years earlier. There was nothing left that required her personal attention. The staff noticed the decline. She moved more slowly. She spoke less frequently. Some days she barely acknowledged them when they entered to bring food or clean. They whispered among themselves about whether they should alert someone, but who would they alert? Her family was dead or estranged. Her friends, if she had any left, had not visited in months. The lawyers and doctors already knew her condition. She received almost no visitors during those final weeks. A lawyer came once to have her sign documents related to the Times-Herald. He stayed 15 minutes, conducted his business, and left. A former staff member from the newspaper visited, claiming to want to check on her, though the visit felt performative, the kind of gesture someone makes so they can later say they tried to help. Cissy sat in her chair by the window during that visit, responding to questions with minimal words, showing no interest in the newspaper gossip the visitor had brought as conversation material. After 20 minutes of unsuccessful attempts at engagement, the visitor made excuses and departed. Cissy watched her leave without expression. She thought about Felicia during those last weeks, though thinking was perhaps too active a word. Felicia's absence was simply present, the way chronic pain was present, a background condition that had been there so long it no longer required active attention. Her daughter was alive somewhere, living a life Cissy knew nothing about, raising children Cissy would never meet. The estrangement was complete and permanent, and thinking about it changed nothing. She thought about Joseph sometimes too. He had been dead for years, but the damage he had caused remained alive. The violence, the custody battle, the loss of Felicia, all of it had happened decades ago, but it had shaped everything that came after. She wondered occasionally what her life might have looked like if she had never met him, if she had married someone else or not married at all. But the wondering was abstract. The actual life she had lived was the only one available. The newspaper meant nothing to her now. Ownership of the Times-Herald had once felt like power, like having a weapon she could use against people who had hurt her. But she had used that weapon for years, and it had not made her less alone or less angry or less aware that everything was temporary and most things were meaningless. The paper would continue after she died, or it would not. Either way, it would not remember her the way a child might, or a friend, or anyone who had reason to care beyond professional obligation. On the evening of July 23rd, she went to bed without incident. The staff brought dinner, which she barely touched. She took her usual medications. She drank her usual amount. She asked for the curtains to be closed, though they were already closed. The staff member adjusted them anyway, wished her good night, and left. The next morning, July 24th, a maid knocked on the bedroom door at 8 o'clock. This was the usual time for morning service, opening curtains, collecting the previous night's dishes, asking what Cissy wanted for breakfast. There was no response. The maid knocked again, louder. Still nothing. She opened the door carefully. Cissy was in bed in the position she normally slept in, but something about the stillness was immediately obvious. The maid approached and understood without needing to check that Cissy was dead. She had died sometime during the night, alone in her bedroom, in a mansion she owned outright, with staff throughout the house who had not heard anything because there had been nothing to hear. The body was discovered. The doctor was called. The appropriate authorities were notified. The machinery of dealing with death began its work: paperwork, arrangements, notifications to whoever needed to be notified. The mansion that had been maintained for Cissy's comfort became the place where her body was handled with professional efficiency. She was 66 years old. She had been wealthy every day of her life. She had owned newspapers, multiple properties, objects that museums would eventually want. She had married a count, hosted presidents, wielded power in America's capital, and she had died alone in the dark, in a house full of rooms that had never been homes. The funeral was held at St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington. The church was appropriate for someone of Cissy's social position, the right denomination, the right location, the kind of place where powerful people were mourned with proper ceremony. The pews filled with politicians, journalists, business executives, the same people who had attended functions at her mansion and read her newspaper and tolerated her because she was wealthy and connected. The eulogies were careful. Speakers praised her business acumen, her success with the Times-Herald, her philanthropy in later years. They mentioned her strength and independence. They did not mention the vindictiveness, the drinking, the decades of using the newspaper as a weapon. They did not mention the failed marriages or the lost daughter. They spoke as people spoke at funerals of the wealthy, emphasizing accomplishments, avoiding complications, performing respect whether they felt it or not. Felicia attended but sat away from the front rows, as though reluctant to claim status as daughter. She did not cry visibly. She did not give a eulogy. After the service, she spoke briefly with a few people, then left. Observers noted that she seemed uncomfortable, as though attending out of obligation rather than grief. She had not reconciled with her mother before death, and death had not changed the estrangement into something meaningful. The will was read in the days following the funeral. Cissy had left the Times-Herald to 7 senior employees, structured so they would share ownership and control. The decision bypassed her family entirely. Felicia received a trust fund, but no involvement with the newspaper. The arrangement was unusual, and legal challenges followed almost immediately. Felicia's husband, Drew Pearson, contested the will, arguing that Cissy had not been mentally competent in her final years. that the employee ownership structure was the result of undue influence or impaired judgment. The legal battle stretched for months. Lawyers argued about Cissy's mental state, about whether the philanthropy and the unusual will provisions suggested deteriorating cognition or simply someone distributing wealth according to her actual wishes. Medical records were examined. Staff members were questioned. The Times-Herald employees who had been named as heirs fought to keep what they had been given. Eventually, the courts upheld the will with minor modifications. The Times-Herald passed to the employees, though the arrangement proved unstable. Within a few years, the ownership structure collapsed under financial pressures and internal disagreements. The paper was sold to the Washington Post in 1954, merged, and eventually disappeared as a distinct publication. The Times-Herald that Cissy had built and controlled became historical footnote, absorbed into a competitor's operations. The DuPont Circle mansion presented a different problem. Cissy had apparently intended to leave it to the Red Cross for use as a headquarters, but the Red Cross declined. The building was too large, too expensive to maintain, designed for private residence rather than organizational use. The location was valuable, but the structure itself was impractical. The mansion sat empty for months while the estate tried to find someone who wanted it. Other organizations were approached: museums, universities, foundations. All declined for similar reasons. The maintenance costs were enormous. The 60 rooms were configured in ways that made them difficult to repurpose. The property was valuable, but the building itself was essentially a burden. It was eventually sold to a private buyer who converted portions of it into offices. Later owners made additional modifications. The grand rooms where Cissy had hosted parties were subdivided. The elaborate decorations were removed or painted over. The mansion that had been designed to demonstrate wealth and status became generic office space, stripped of the features that had made it impressive. Dower House, the Maryland estate, faced similar fate. The property was too large for most individual buyers, too expensive to maintain as a private residence, unsuitable for institutional use. It changed hands several times, with each owner struggling to justify the costs. Eventually, it was subdivided. The main house sold separately from the land. The unified estate Cissy had created broken into pieces that were easier to manage and sell. The Wyoming ranch was sold to someone who actually wanted to run cattle. The rustic mansion Cissy had built was used by the new owner for a few years, then demolished as impractical. The land remained, but the structure that represented Cissy's romanticized version of Western independence was destroyed without particular ceremony or regret. The philanthropy endured in ways the properties did not. The hospital wing continued operating, treating children who never knew who Patterson was or why her name was on the building. The scholarships continued funding students, most of whom had never heard of the Times-Herald or Cissy's journalism career. The programs she had funded kept working, divorced from any memory of the person whose money had created them. But the charitable legacy was accidental, in a sense. Cissy had given money in her final years, but she had not built organizations or created sustained philanthropic structures. The donations were isolated gestures, helpful but not transformative, impactful in specific cases but not reshaping entire fields. Within a generation, most recipients had forgotten the source of the funding, remembered only that money had arrived when needed. Her name faded quickly from public memory. Washington's political and social landscape shifted with each administration, each cycle of new arrivals replacing old ones. The people who had known Cissy, who had attended her parties or worked at her newspaper or been targets of her editorial attacks, gradually died or moved away. The younger generation had no particular reason to remember a newspaper editor who had been active decades earlier, whose paper no longer existed, whose positions during World War II had been on the wrong side of history. Histories of Washington journalism mentioned her, usually briefly. She was noted as one of the first women to own and operate a major newspaper, though the qualification was always that she had purchased rather than built the paper, that she had inherited wealth rather than earned position through merit. The coverage acknowledged her influence, but also her vindictiveness, her political blindness, her personal problems. Felicia never spoke publicly about her mother. When journalists occasionally tried to interview her about the famous newspaper editor, she declined. The estrangement that had defined their relationship continued as silence after death. Whatever Felicia remembered or felt about Cissy remained private, a grief or anger or indifference that was not available for public consumption. The objects Cissy had collected, the art, the furniture, the jewelry, were dispersed through sales and donations. Some pieces ended up in museums, valued for their historical or aesthetic significance without connection to their previous owner. Most were simply sold, entering the secondary market where their value was determined by condition and provenance, not by the biography of the woman who had once owned them. By the end of the 20th century, Cissy Patterson was barely remembered outside specialized historical research. The Times-Herald was gone. The properties had been sold or demolished or converted beyond recognition. The philanthropy continued without attribution. The family name Patterson meant something in journalism history because of the Tribune, but Cissy's specific role was increasingly obscure. She had been immensely wealthy. She had owned property worth millions. She had controlled a major newspaper in the nation's capital. And within 50 years of her death, almost nothing remained that bore her mark. The wealth had not created lasting legacy. The power had not ensured memory. The grand gestures, the mansion, the parties, the editorial campaigns had proven temporary, swept away by time and changing circumstances. There are questions about Cissy Patterson that wealth never answered. Whether the violence from Joseph would have mattered less if she had kept Felicia. Whether owning the Times-Herald filled any space that actually needed filling. Whether the philanthropy in her final years meant she had learned something, or simply that she had run out of other ways to use money that had never solved anything. She had everything the 19th century told women to want: beauty, marriage to titled nobility, entrance into the highest levels of society. When those things failed, she acquired everything the 20th century suggested might work instead: financial independence, professional power, control over public discourse. None of it protected her from ending up alone in a dark bedroom, waiting for her heart to stop. The houses were sold or demolished. The newspaper was absorbed into a competitor and erased. The daughter remained estranged until death and silent afterward. The fortune was distributed according to legal documents, creating benefits for strangers and institutions that forgot her name within years. What remained was mostly in archives: photographs of parties that looked elegant and empty, editorials that had been wrong about the war. Society page mentions that documented presence without explaining what any of it meant. She had been born into wealth that was supposed to be protection, married into titles that were supposed to be elevation, built power that was supposed to be security. Each acquisition revealed new forms of vulnerability. Each success created new kinds of failure. The custody battle demonstrated that courts did not care about money when they decided who deserved a child. The newspaper demonstrated that influence was not the same as connection. The properties demonstrated that space was not the same as home. There is no redemption in the ending, but there is no simple condemnation either. She was cruel to people who had not particularly harmed her. She was also harmed by people she could not escape. She used power vindictively. She also understood what powerlessness felt like. She died wealthy and died alone, and both facts were true simultaneously, without one canceling the other. What Cissy Patterson's life demonstrated, if it demonstrated anything, was that wealth could purchase almost everything except the specific things that would have made the wealth unnecessary. The money remained after she was gone. The loneliness remained until she was not.